So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're starting a new series based on another speech given by an Answers in Genesis employee. This time it's the Ark Encounter's zookeeper, Karina Altman. It turns out they have some real animals there, but they don't keep them in the Ark, because ironically enough, it's utterly unsuited to housing livestock. I'm not sure why this isn't a hint to AIG and the visitors that it's a problem when their alleged floating zoo can't house animals. But it's not like you can both be a creationist and someone who carefully considers his beliefs.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk today. So we are going to discuss creation or evolution. Where did all of the species come from?
I look forward to hearing your evidence that known and well-documented biological processes are in fact fictional. And I suspect you will rely on some of the same processes to make your story fit. But that's jumping the gun.
So there's a wide variety of animals in the world today, and I've been very fortunate to be able to work with so many of them. There's actually about 2 million species of animals on Earth, and thousands more have gone extinct.
Probably a lot more than thousands, but yes, there are a whole heck of a lot of species extant and extinct. And I agree, it is pretty cool that you've been hands-on with so many. Far more than most people ever have been or will.
It's amazing the variety of life we have here. But where did they all come from? Did God create them all as is in the Garden of Eden? And if so, how could Noah have fit all of these animals on the ark?
Well, that's easy. Both the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark are not historical events. So the answer is no. God didn't create anything in the Garden of Eden, and Noah didn't fit anything on his fictional ark.
Or did they evolve from a common ancestor millions of years ago?
Yes they did. Although in some cases, you may have to go back over 1 billion years to find the common ancestor of some lineages.
And if not, how could so many species form in only 6,000 years?
They couldn't. Speciation takes a while, and you haven't had long enough since your proposed flood.
Well, I'm going to answer some of those questions today and walk you through how all of this is possible using biblical authority and God's Word.
I hope you've got more than that, because as I've said before on this channel, reality is prior to the Bible, even by Christian accounts. Reality existed before the Bible, and the only way to know if you're right about the Bible is by testing your interpretation of it against reality. So ultimately, the Bible is only evidence for what the Bible says. But that the Bible says something isn't really evidence for that thing. Now, I might make a few exceptions for events that are not well attested archaeologically, but involving surrounding figures who are reasonably well tested. For example, we have a bit of archaeological information that King David was a real person. And so the biblical stories about him are probably at least based on a kernel of truth, and provide some evidence about his life. But they cannot stand on their own as proof.
So first of all, why does it matter? Animals are really cool, but shouldn't the gospel be our priority? Shouldn't churches focus on the story of Jesus and salvation?
I'm not here to tell you what to do, and science is a reliable way to find truth about subjects open to empirical investigation. This includes the origin of species.
Well, let's take a look real quick. This is typically what's presented to your kids in Sunday school or your grandkids. This is a fairy tale Garden of Eden. It's very cutesy looking. And you also usually get something like this. These are the images that are portrayed to your kids and grandkids in church. Unfortunately, churches often treat history like a children's story. You often hear the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Noah's Ark.
Shock! Horror! This just in, people tell stories to kids like they're kids' stories. I mean, would you prefer that the churches tell them in graphic detail about the drowning of the babies during the flood? But of course, they are stories, a word you seem not to like, because a story is just what you call it when you relay a sequence of events. Stories can be true or false in a literal sense. These happen to be false in that way. But just calling them stories doesn't imply that they aren't true.
And kids get in their mind this idea that it's kind of a fairy tale, and churches don't really reinforce that this is true actual history.
Nor should they, because the idea of Noah's Ark is on par with the flat Earth in terms of plausibility. It is trivial to come up with an indefinite number of reasons the story as told in the Bible simply cannot be a literal event in world history.
Children are the key, and if they can be convinced the Bible stories aren't real, then none of the Bible is real. You can't believe the gospel and not believe Genesis. You can't pick and choose what to believe in the Bible.
The Bible is made up of numerous books, written by and for different audiences, for different purposes at different times. It is not a monolith. It's entirely possible that various parts of it are of various levels of trustworthiness. It could be the case that Genesis is totally made up, but the books of Chronicles are quite accurate. I don't know if you know this, but the table of contents in your Bible isn't actually part of the Bible. The Bible is just a conventional list of separate scriptures that have been bound together for your convenience. And not everyone has the same list. I own quite a few such bound collections, all labeled the Bible, or some variation, and they have different books in them. Some include the books of Maccabees, some treat all the minor prophets as a single work, etc.
And one of the most disputed topics regarding the accuracy of Scripture is Noah's Ark and the animals being able to fit.
Right, because the number of extant animal species is far too high to have all had members aboard, even if we exclude anything aquatic or that isn't an amniote, which seems to be AIG's tact.
Now, when you see images like the one up on screen, where you've got animals peeking out all over the place, bursting out of this tiny little ship, it really doesn't seem plausible. So it's very important that kids are being taught the correct history and that it is true. It is not just a fairy tale story.
See, the thing is, though, that those childish representations, while not accurate to the text, aren't really significantly more absurd than what you actually believe. Plus, they're meant to keep children occupied. Some boring long wooden boat isn't really that interesting when one is at the age where shapes and colors are still a bit beyond one's mastery.
So Answers in Genesis actually did a survey. You can read about it in Ready to Return, which is a book in the bookstore you can purchase. America's Research Group surveyed 20 to 29-year-olds in the United States who grew up in the church and stayed in church. Now, this was not a multiple choice question. They were asked, why don't you believe that the Bible is accurate? And they basically grouped these guys' answers into these main categories. And you'll notice most of these categories involve Genesis not being accurate.
That's not surprising. As a general rule, the closer the events in various works are to the time of their writing, the more accurate they tend to be. Since Genesis was compiled some 2 millennia or more from the supposed time of the events that it describes, it is not surprising that it is quite unreliable as history. It's also probably the book with the most events that we know for sure didn't happen, like the Garden of Eden and the Flood.
So the belief in Genesis is very important to the belief in the entire rest of the Bible, including the gospel. If God made a mistake in Genesis, how do we know he didn't make a mistake in the gospel?
It's not really my place to critique your theology, as I don't really care about that for the purposes of this channel. I just want to point out that most Christians don't really see it that way, and by not seeing it that way, they can be Christians without being the intellectual equivalent of flat earthers.
Genesis is often believed to have been disproved because they don't believe that the ark could have happened, that all of those animals could have fit on the ship.
They sound smart.
And these are pretty serious statistics. Young people are leaving the church because of these issues, so it's important that you do have answers. Now, a lot of people think that Jesus doesn't really talk about this topic, but that is inaccurate. Jesus does mention it several times.
I don't care, so I'm cutting out all these bits about Jesus.
So, we're going to talk about several things in my discussion today. First, we're going to talk about both worldviews. What do both sides, the creationists and the evolutionists, believe about where all the animals came from? Next, we'll talk about the basics of animal classification and the differences between animal kinds and species. These are two very important and very different words, and we'll discuss in depth what those words mean and why it's important.
You heard it here, folks. She is promising to talk about what a kind is, so I expect to get a real definition of kind by the end of this.
Then we're going to talk about causes of diversity in the animal kingdom. How did we get all these species we see today? We're also going to talk about how we identify these animal kinds.
Further confirmation that you're planning to give us a useful way to determine if things are in different kinds or not according to creationism. That's promising, but somehow I feel like the promise may end up unfulfilled.
And lastly, we'll discuss how all the animals fit on Noah's Ark. So we'll start with talking about both worldviews. So it is more of a battle of worldviews versus science and religion. So this is a great comic that Answers in Genesis made, where it shows how secularists often try to say that we are biased because we go off the Bible, and they're not biased because they only use man's reasoning. But that is actually a bias.
I mean, I guess you could say that science is biased in favor of accepting reality as it presents itself, but that's not really a bad thing, since any contradictory bias would be a bias towards being wrong.
Creationists and evolutionists actually have the exact same evidence. We have the same fossils, we have the same world, we have the exact same animals. But our worldviews, our starting points, are the glasses that we use to interpret that evidence. Depending on your starting point, you can get two very different conclusions from the exact same evidence.
Right, if your bias is to say that reality is real and that things that contradict it are wrong to the degree to which they contradict reality, you'll reach correct, or at least likely to be correct, conclusions. If your bias is to say that your pet interpretation of an ancient text is correct despite reality, you will be wrong. Those are very different conclusions.
So we need to decide whether we're going to start with man's authority or God's authority. And again, man's authority is not objective like they try to tell you. It is just as biased.
Why don't we just start with reality? The thing we each observe. That's not man's authority because humans didn't invent reality, they just tried to describe it. An accurate description of reality, or a framework for understanding it that has predictive power, is not man's authority, just because it was humans who came up with it.
All right, so you often have people asking, maybe, hello? There we go. People often ask you if you believe in science or religion. Now, this is actually a logical fallacy, which is the fallacy of bifurcation, which is incorrectly implying that the two views are mutually exclusive. It's saying that you can't be scientific and religious. This is actually not true.
Well, it's not really bifurcation unless you want to say that being scientific is the only way to be irreligious, and that not being scientific means you can't be irreligious. In fact, this is more of a general fallacy of false dichotomy. An example of fallacy of bifurcation would be, you can either be a Christian or an atheist. It's a fallacy of bifurcation because while it is true that you can either be a Christian or not a Christian, there are a lot of ways besides being an atheist to not be a Christian. But being an atheist is indeed one of the ways to definitely not be a Christian. I realize I'm splitting hairs a bit here.
You can believe in and practice science and still be a Christian. We actually employ many scientists right here at Answers in Genesis, plenty of which have PhDs in their field.
Right, that's why it's not bifurcation. That fallacy requires that the options in fact be mutually exclusive, but that one of them not be the only contradictory option. Also, you employ scientists whose work has had no impact and who are bound by the terms of their employment to continue being wrong despite any evidence to the contrary. So please forgive me if I consider their status as working scientists dubious at best. Although I won't really dispute that you do have real PhDs working for you.
It is not a battle of science versus religion. It's man's authority versus God authority. Did life appear by chance or was it designed by God?
No one thinks it was a chance process that created life. Because if we assume a naturalistic process of abiogenesis, then it would have happened according to the laws of chemistry, which are not simply random. For example, if I pass enough electrical current through a mole of H2O, I'm going to get a mole of H2 and half a mole of O2. That's not a chance-based conclusion. That's just the pretty darn deterministic laws of chemistry. Granted, organic chemistry is more complicated, but it's no less chemical for that fact.
Now, the Bible never changes, but the scientific models and theories often do change. Ken Ham always likes to say, people tell him, well, the Bible's not a science textbook. Well, thank goodness, because science textbooks always change.
That's a good thing. Science keeps correcting itself when new data comes to light. That's the honest thing to do. Now, granted, the Bible is a set of books that have already been written, so it's in a different category. But your theology can and should adjust itself to conform to what is known about reality. And if it can't, then it's time to toss it out. It turns out most Christians think it can adjust to reality, but hey, if you think it can't, you're just turning Christianity into something you have to be ignorant or perverse to believe.
The Bible never changes, and the Bible does actually talk about biology and animals and science, so we can always trust it when it does talk about those topics.
No.
That's the opposite of the correct interpretation. If something never bothers to change, even when new evidence is available, it means that that thing is going to be wrong. And it's going to be wrong forever. Science is trustworthy because it changes, not despite that. And the way we can tell is that it works. Science makes predictions that are borne out. And when they are not, the science changes. After this, she goes on into some more quotations from the Bible to say that the Bible is important. I don't care, so I cut them out.
So let's talk about what the evolutionists believe first. So they believe in something called the tree.
I've never heard it called quite that, but sure, it's an okay name, I guess.
So often looks like this. You guys might recognize this from your science textbooks growing up. So this is what the evolutionary model believes. They believe that life came from non-life.
You're wrong.
You're so wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong.
That chart in no way says that life came from non-life. It indicates that all life shares a common ancestor, but makes no claims about where that ancestor came from. Please stop lying about evolution, and let's be honest, if you felt well-educated enough to give a speech about evolution, then I'll assume you know enough about the topic to get it right if you want to. I'm really tired of people misrepresenting evolution, cladograms, and phylogenetic trees.
Life spontaneously arose from non-life 3.7 billion years ago. Now, it's a mystery how this happened. No one knows.
A mystery that's becoming less and less mysterious as research continues. But let's just pretend that that's not the case, right?
I've heard many different theories throughout my science courses. Some people even believe that now we're all aliens, that there were microbes on a meteorite that crashed into Earth, and those microbes are where life started. But what's the problem there? It still doesn't address where those microbes came from.
Yeah, I'm sure no one but creationists realize that panspermia doesn't solve the question of the origin of life.
So they can't really tell you where this life came from or how it started. We just have to believe that it did.
Can science tell us for sure where life came from or how it started? No, because you have no way of testing your ideas against reality and refuse to even try. The difference is that science is making progress on the question. You are just okay with saying that it was magic and leaving it at that.
They also believe that all life has a common ancestor, which is where you get this tree from. It doesn't matter if it's a dinosaur, an elephant, or a mushroom, or a tree, or a person. We all share the exact same ancestor.
Yep, that is all that chart is attempting to convey. You finally got there.
But again, we don't know what that ancestor is. It's a mystery. We just have to believe that there was one.
I mean, identifying a particular organism as the last universal common ancestor for all life would be a pretty daunting task. But we can know some things about it. For example, it was probably a single-celled organism without a nucleus that formed proteins based on a DNA molecule that formed a ring floating freely in the cell. It would probably have resembled modern bacteria, but been significantly more simple than any living bacterium.
Next, they believe that changes within animals are undirected. It's random, it's a natural phenomena that's just random by chance, and it requires a lot of time to form all these different species because of that.
Well, mutations are undirected, but the result of populations reproducing with mutations are directed by selection pressure. So no, it's not chance and random. Part of it is, but the end result cannot simply be said to be random. For example, if you can identify a specific pressure that will remain constant in an environment for a while, you can predict the sort of thing that will evolve. One easy example is camouflage. If a population of organisms is being preyed on, and they would be harder to catch if they resemble the environment more to their predators, then we can predict that out of the random mutations that can change their appearance, those that make them less distinct from their surroundings will be favored, and the population will evolve to be inconspicuous to predators.
They also believe that animals evolve into different animals.
Animals speciate and will always remain members of the clades to which their ancestors belonged. So unless you're going to be way more specific, I can't really say if you're being accurate. Although the argument could be made that you're being so vague that you're being inaccurate for that reason alone.
So, like one animal into a totally different animal, like dinosaurs totally turning into birds.
Except birds are totally dinosaurs. They're not totally different animals. Birds are a subset of dinosaurs the same way that canines are a subset of mammals. Birds didn't cease to be dinosaurs, not even a little.
And lastly, they believe that modifications result in entirely new structures and animals.
Kind of, but when you really dig into it, even things that seem like entirely new structures always derive from modifications of what came before in ancestors. And if you were there to watch the whole process in real time, assuming you could live that long, at no point would a new organ simply appear. Instead, already existing body structures would slowly acquire new functions, then lose old ones, all while modifying their shape and size. It's only looking back that we can say something new has arisen. In reality, though, it is always the same structures existing in a continuum.
Now, there are several problems with this tree. First of all, there are no eyewitness accounts of any of this.
So your first problem with this tree is something that isn't a problem? In what world does no eyewitness make something not true, or even less likely to be true? There were no eyewitnesses to Neptune before it was suggested it should be there based on irregularities in the orbit of Uranus all the way back to 1846. Does that mean we shouldn't have believed in it? There are no eyewitnesses to many criminal cases that are nevertheless solved. Should we toss out all forensic science? In fact, chances are that no one was around to see your embryological development. Does that mean we should assume it did not happen? Obviously, the answer is no. A lack of eyewitness testimony does nothing to tell us whether something is true or not.
Everything is guesswork, and the origin theories change all the time. Like I said, I've heard multiple different ones just in my studies, so they never can agree on what actually happened.
What you mean is that scientists update their ideas based on new data, and in fact, they can agree on quite a lot. Most of the tree of life is pretty well established, although there is always something to learn. But chances are, you're not going to find anytime soon that evolutionary biologists have discovered that frogs are more closely related to raccoons than raccoons are to tigers, or that fungi are more closely related to plants than animals. You're looking at a 1,000-piece puzzle, with 2/3 of the pieces in place, another 1/6 still to be fit in, and the last 1/6 missing. All the pieces seem to make a picture of a train, but you're insisting that not only is the puzzle not really a train, but you don't even think it's a single puzzle. You'd prefer we take seriously the idea that it's really 110-piece puzzles all picturing completely different things.
Also, this theory violates several major scientific laws. Firstly, it violates the law of biogenesis, which says life cannot arise from non-life.
There isn't really a law of biogenesis. In fact, searching for it primarily returns results from creationist pseudoscience. What is really meant by biogenesis in this context is that there is no vital force which can turn dead matter into living organisms. So mice do not spawn out of dirty clothing, maggots do not spawn out of rotting meat. Instead, cellular life is created from previous cellular life via biological reproduction. Nothing about this precludes abiogenesis. Also, laws of physics can be broken, and all that means is that it was never a valid law in the first place. Early, you warned against using the wisdom of man, which you seem to identify with modern science. But these laws you complain about evolution violating are just that, the wisdom of man. Because all laws of nature are descriptions of humans based on how the universe works. So on the basis of your own train of thought, that these laws may be violated is not a particular problem for an idea. Of course, evolution doesn't really break any laws of nature anyway, so it's a moot point.
It violates the law of cause and effect, which says nothing occurs by chance.
There is no such law. In fact, quantum mechanics is inherently chance-based, and attempts to uncover hidden variables to recover a non-stochastic mechanism have met with not only no success, but in fact indications that there may be, in fact, no such hidden variables. One significant example of this occurs in light polarization, which behaves in such a way that polarized filters, of the type you might use to watch a 3D movie at the theater, can act in ways that would be impossible if there were a single true polarization state for light. So not only is there no law of nature stating that nothing is random, in fact, reality is, at its most fundamental level, inherently random as far as anyone can tell.
It violates the first law of thermodynamics, which says energy cannot be created or destroyed.
That's not what the first law of thermodynamics says. Instead, it says that the total energy, including energy in the form of matter, in an isolated system must remain constant. But evolution doesn't involve any violation of that law, even under your incorrect simplification of it. Do you think evolution posits that organisms come out of thin air? Because I think you'll find that that idea is far more in line with divine creation than the theory of evolution.
And it also violates the second law of thermodynamics, which says things tend toward disorder, randomness, and chaos.
Again, that's not the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that the total amount of energy that can be used to do work in an isolated system must always stay the same or decrease. Put another way, it says that the total number of quantum microstates that can express the macro state of an isolated system must always increase or stay the same. In neither case does evolution suggest any decrease in global entropy for an isolated system. Also, when a creationist says this to you, ask him for the kind of units you might use for entropy. Here's a hint, he needs to use units of energy per unit of mass. Typically joules per kilogram, although technically any unit of energy per unit mass can work.
For example, if you were to take your car today and park it out in the woods and leave it for 10 years, when you come back, is that car going to look better or is it going to look worse?
My subjective assessment of the aesthetics of an abandoned car has nothing to do with the total amount of energy in an isolated system available to do work. In fact, even its ability to operate as a vehicle has nothing to do with it.
It's going to look worse, right? It's going to be all rusted out and damaged. Things tend toward disorder and chaos. They do not get better.
Do they? Maybe many things do from your perspective, but an anthropocentric view of order and chaos have nothing to do with thermodynamics.
And lastly, there are no observable mechanisms for an animal or structure to change into a different animal or structure. This has never been seen or recorded.
Well, it's been seen and recorded that animals and their anatomy can change over time through evolution, so unless you're going to be way more specific about what you mean by a different animal or structure, this statement is essentially meaningless.
All right, so what do creationists believe? What does the Bible say? Now, we believe that God created everything, right? Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." We believe he created the universe in 6 24-hour days, just like Genesis 1 describes.
Then you're going to run into serious problems from astronomy, geology, biology, paleontology, biogeography, astrophysics, etc. But hey, if you want to be wrong about religion, I can't stop you.
So instead of a tree, we believe in something called the orchard, and it looks more like this.
A series of trees arbitrarily cut off at some undefined point for no particular reason other than because it makes you feel not too much like evolution must be true, but enough like it's true that you can pretend it helps your absurd arc story? Got it.
So we believe that life came from life. God created everything, right? We also believe that the original animal kinds were created 6,000 years ago.
Really, believing the world was created 6,000 years ago is about the same level of error as estimating the drive from Miami, Florida to Seattle, Washington at about 23 feet or 7 meters, when in fact it is nearly 3,300 miles or about 5,300 kilometers. It's staggering how wrong that is. The approximate age of the Earth is not in dispute within about 3 orders of magnitude among anyone who is willing to look at the data honestly. But no, you just want to pretend the Earth is 750,000 times younger than it is, and I'm being generous to you by using the age of the Earth and not the universe.
Now, we'll get back to that word kinds in a moment, and we get the years, the 6,000 years from the biblical genealogies, adding up that time period.
You keep saying you'll get back to that word, but really you've used it so many times now that it should really have already been defined. Otherwise, no one really knows what you're saying.
We also believe that changes within animal kinds are directed, that they are designed features that God placed in the genetics of these animals at creation.
So no new variation came about after that, eh? I assume that means we should never see more variation in anything you call a kind than could be fit into the number of animals representing that kind that you think got on the ark. So we'll see if you can identify any supposed kinds and look at that prediction. If it's wrong, I feel safe in calling your model nonsense.
We also believe that no new animal kinds have ever evolved. We'll get back to that word again in a moment. And we also believe that modifications occur in structures that already exist.
Well, that's exactly what evolution describes. So I don't know that that's something you can use to contrast your ideas with the standard model in science.
So instead of having all life, whether it's a tree, a mushroom, or a person, coming from one ancestor, we believe that there were multiple ancestors within their kinds created during creation week, and that's where those animals come from, which is why we have an orchard versus a tree.
I do want to quickly point out that the idea of a single common ancestor for all life has not always been uncontroversial in biology, even after the widespread acceptance of evolutionary theory. It is possible that upon examination we could find evidence for multiple sources for life that had persisted to today. For example, we could have found a class of organisms that used a different set of amino acids, since modern life as a rule only uses 20 of the 22 amino acids. The two excluded are selenocysteine and pyrrolysine. Or one with a very different way of storing amino acid sequence in its genetic material, perhaps as groups of 4 nucleotides instead of 3. Or with a radically different assignment to the meaning of the various groups of 3 nucleotides in DNA. Nothing about that seems impossible from a chemical standpoint, and the fact is that no such life has been discovered, and the presence of highly conserved genes in various organisms indicates that yes, life almost certainly had a single common ancestor population.
We have the cat tree, we have the dog tree, we have the primate tree, and the human tree, versus everything coming from one thing.
Why aren't humans in the primate tree? They have all the morphological traits that have resulted in every other member of the primate tree being included in it, such as fully enclosed orbits, large brains, extremely flexible shoulder joints, nails rather than claws, opposable thumbs, trichromacy, etc. But then, why are cats and dogs on different trees? Why not have a carnivora tree? They all have the typical claws, digits, skulls, and teeth of members of that order. Why are they not a tree? But then, why are not all of the things you mentioned part of the mammal tree? They all have jaws made of only the dentary bone, they all can produce milk from mammary glands to feed their young, they all develop ear bones from pharyngeal arches that in other animals go on to produce jaw bones posterior to the dentary, they all lack true temporal fenestrae, but they all have zygomatic arches made of the bones expected for such a structure, and which still serve to allow passage of jaw muscles from the skull to the posterior lateral part of the jawbone. They all have heterodont dentition with the same types of teeth, namely incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. Why isn't mammal a tree?
Now, there are several confirmations of the orchard. Genesis 1 is the eyewitness account of creation. God was there. He had Moses write it down for us.
Good luck proving that God really told anyone to write it down, or that that person was Moses. But even if he did, if it conflicts with reality, which it does, then your interpretation is stupid and should be thrown in the trash.
Biblical genealogies do show the age of the earth to be about 6,000 years.
No, biblical genealogies can be interpreted as indicating that the biblical authors thought that the earth was about 6,000 years old. That's all they can do on their own. They don't even tell us definitively that the people who wrote them took them seriously as literal facts.
And we observe animals changing within their kinds today.
Well, you haven't bothered to define a kind except to say that they all come from the same tree, and since evolution precludes anything from doing otherwise, that's not exactly a slam dunk for anti-evolution.
New species and animal breeds are constantly being formed, but this is not evolution, and we'll get more into that as I keep talking.
That most certainly is evolution. It's not evolution on a grand scale, but it's like looking at a rivulet in the dirt caused by your garden hose and saying it's not erosion, because it's not much like the Grand Canyon.
All right, so let's go back to that word kinds. What exactly is a kind? Well, let's look at what the Bible says. So right here in Genesis, we get it mentioned a lot. Genesis 1:24 through 25 says, "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good." That was a lot of times that God said the word kinds. So actually, God mentions or uses the phrase according to its or their kinds 10 times during days 3, 5, and 6 of creation. So days 3 was plants, day 5 was air and sea animals, and day 6 was land animals and people. So when God repeats things, he wants it emphasized, right? And he says it 10 times in this one chapter.
Right, but it's not defined, so I don't care how emphasized it is, it doesn't tell us what a kind is, not in any scientifically useful way.
Next, we'll look at what he says when we're dealing with the ark. Genesis 6:19 through 20. God tells Noah, "You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive."
Again, that doesn't include a definition. Does she not know what a definition is? Would she recognize one if she read one?
Next, Genesis 7:2 through 3. God says, "Take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth." God mentions kinds 7 times in his instructions to Noah. So again, this is a very important term.
I'm perfectly willing to grant its importance to the narrative of Genesis, but that doesn't really help us know what a kind is. Hey there, YouTube, and welcome to a very special episode of Noah's Zookeeper. This time it's animated, and as you can probably see, I'm in a tutu. That's because my chat managed to hit the single stream target of $100 US to get me to wear a tutu on a video. This occurred during Kent with Ben 17, Dude, Where's My Con Man? On February 25th, 2020. So I'd like to thank everyone who donated, watched, liked, or commented on that video or any of my videos. Your support means a lot to me, and without you guys, I probably would have quit doing this a while ago. Anyway, back to what you're actually here for. When last we left off, Karina Altman was reading off Bible passages that included the word kind, as if that somehow constituted a definition of the word. Spoilers, she's not done yet.
Now, when Noah gets off the ark, God says, "Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number upon it." So in Genesis 8, it is inferred that God commands these animals to reproduce according to their kinds to repopulate the post-flood world. And in the New Testament, Paul actually says, "All flesh is not the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another."
None of that tells us what kind means, and now Paul seems to be indicating some other use of that word kind, because I don't think that your original idea of orchards has much to do with what kind of meat things are made of, which is what Paul seems to be talking about. Although it's pretty vague, and since it doesn't involve a definition, I don't really care to look it up, as it's so far irrelevant.
So Paul makes it clear, even in the New Testament, that there are differences among God's created beings. We are not from all one ancestor. We are very different depending on what we are.
Okay, I looked it up, and it seems that Paul is just talking here about various things that exist and aren't the same. He goes on to talk about celestial bodies and the glory of heavenly objects, and then to conclude that the bodies that people will have at the resurrection will be different than the ones they have today in some unspecified but qualitative way. I think it's a big leap to go from that to inferring some statement about ancestry.
So what are these biblical kinds? Well, in order to figure that out, we have to go back to our science class and learn our basics of animal classification. So this is Carl Linnaeus. So he was actually a creationist himself, and he is actually the father of modern taxonomy.
Indeed, and he was confused by the nested hierarchy of life that he did not predict based on the idea of special creation, but that was objectively present in life. He also thought humans belonged with the apes.
There we go. So he was a Swedish botanist who lived from 1707 to 1778. Taxonomy is the classification of living things. And Carl Linnaeus published 12 editions of his Systema Naturae, which introduced modern taxonomy and binomial nomenclature, which is the scientific names of animals. And Linnaeus actually often spoke of created kinds. He believed he was merely revealing the order God had put into nature.
Yup, a man who was alive before evolution by natural selection and common descent had been proposed didn't bother considering them. Not really surprising or significant, but you're not wrong.
So here's a quote from his book, actually. "God, infinite, omniscient, and omnipotent, woke me up and I was amazed. I have read some clues through his created things, and all of which is his will, even in the smallest things and the most minute. How much wisdom, what an inscrutable perfection." So his methods are still used today, and he was a creationist.
Well, his methods have been updated, and the original rules that were used for taxonomy are already being switched over to the still being compiled phylocode, which requires taxa to be monophyletic to be accepted. That being said, even after the full switch to the phylocode, most of Linnaeus' work and the older rules will result in about the same taxa, with the same name, containing pretty much the same organisms. It's really a testament of how obvious evolutionary relationships are, even when they are not recognized as such.
Which is pretty interesting. A lot of scientists will try to tell you that most scientists are not creationists, but actually a lot of the founding fathers of science were.
But are leading scientists still mostly creationists? Because I noticed you did a sneaky little tense change from present to past tense. And yeah, most scientists were creationists back when it was pretty much the only thing to be. Just like most of them in Europe before the Protestant Reformation were Catholic, since it was basically the only way to be in Europe until that point, unless you were Jewish.
All right, so we're going to review the basics of animal classification. Now, there are a minimum of 7 taxons, or categories. There are sometimes more. We're just going to go over the basics.
First, the plural for taxon is taxa, because it takes the singular form of a Greek second declension neuter noun, and the regular plural ending for such a noun in the nominative case is an alpha that replaces the singular omicron nu ending. English tends to borrow from Greek's nominative case, so yeah, it's taxa, not taxons. Second, it's not that there are a minimum of 7 taxa, it's just that those are the ranks that Linnaeus came up with. It was a decent starting point, but we now know that there are so many intermediate taxa that the idea of ranking them has become essentially meaningless. That being said, giving the 7 Linnaean ranks for an organism will still give you a pretty decent idea of where it belongs in taxonomy.
So we're going to classify a jaguar. Now, a jaguar actually has the strongest bite of any cat relative to its size. It's a pretty fascinating animal. So we're going to classify him. So your first category is a kingdom, and he belongs to Animalia. There are 6 kingdoms. You have Archaebacteria and Eubacteria, which are just different kinds of bacteria. You have protists, like amoebas, algae.
Whoops! Protista isn't a valid taxon, as it's paraphyletic, in that it excludes animals, fungi, and plants, even though they are closer to some members of Protista then those members of Protista are to other members of the supposed kingdom. So maybe you meant to go with Eukarya, but that's a domain. See, this is why relying on Linnaean ranks doesn't work too well.
As well as fungus, plants, and animals. So jaguar is obviously an animal. He belongs to the animal kingdom. So next you have what's called phylum, and he belongs to the chordata, which is vertebrates, which are animals with backbones.
Whoops again. Vertebrata is only part of chordata. There are, in fact, invertebrate chordates. Sea squirts or tunicates, and lanceolets are all invertebrates, and yet they are chordates. Man, even sticking to just the Linnaean taxa, she's doing a pretty bad job at this. But at least so far, she hasn't misclassified the jaguar, just misdefined the taxa she's using.
There are 36 phyla, and actually 35 of them are invertebrates, which are animals without backbones.
Well, even the one that has vertebrates doesn't only contain vertebrates.
So all animals with a backbone belong to this one phylum here. Next, we have classes. There are 6 classes within vertebrates. You have your mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, bony fish, and cartilaginous fish, which are things like sharks and stingrays.
Ouch! Except that all of those but the cartilaginous fish are all part of the bony fish, the osteichthyes. Also, you didn't bother to include hagfish or lampreys, who aren't in any of the groups you mentioned. Additionally, the birds fall under the reptile category. So I guess you're wrong on that again. This is going really poorly for you. Probably because the taxonomic system you're using is fundamentally underpowered and has been corrected.
So he's obviously a mammal, right? So he's going to be in class mammal. Next, we have the orders within mammals. There's 26, and these include categories like rodents, primates, bats, marsupials, carnivores. So he's a carnivore. He's a meat eater. So he belongs to order Carnivora.
Okay, but being a carnivore doesn't put you in order Carnivora, nor does being in order Carnivora make you a carnivore. For example, many bats are carnivores, but they're in Chiroptera, and pandas eat pretty much nothing but grass, and they're in Carnivora.
Next, you've got family. There are 6 families within Carnivora, and that includes dogs, cats, something called mustelids, which are like otters, pinnipeds, which are seals and sea lions, ursids, which are bears, and vivarids, which are things like hyenas and mongooses. So he belongs to the feline kind. He's a cat, right?
Well, feline is a bit ambiguous. What about civets, hyenas, binturongs, fossas, and mongooses? They're all much more cat-like than they are like bears, seals, raccoons, or dogs, all of whom are much more like each other than the first group. Why are you failing to distinguish between Feliformia and Felidae? Is it to keep the illusion that animals aren't related?
And then next we've got our genuses. Genuses, there are 3 within the cat kind. There are big cats, small cats, and cheetahs. Cheetahs get their own group because they're kind of special. So jaguar, he's obviously a big cat, so he belongs to Panthera. And the very last thing you have is your species. Now this is the most specific categorization of animals, and so he's species Onca, so he is the jaguar.
You got to a section where I have nothing to complain about. Finally.
So species are always written in binomial nomenclature, which looks like this, Panthera onca, and it's always in Latin.
Except when it's Greek, or Mandarin, or English, or a whole host of other languages. In fact, the genus name you just cited is Greek.
And that is because, it's italicized as well. And that is because this can be used worldwide, so they're recognized no matter what country they're in. If a scientist writes about Panthera onca, no matter what country you're in, they know they're talking about the jaguar.
But Latin doesn't help with that. What helps is the rule that a genus name can never be reused, and that within a genus, no species name can be reused. Technically, you could describe a new species in its own genus as your mom. That's 2 words, and it's fine. And now if you're the first one to name that genus and species, then the worldwide scientific community is just stuck with it. That's why there are like 9 different animals named in various ways after Barack Obama. And there's a dinosaur genus named after Thanos, the Marvel supervillain.
All right, so species are always changing though, right? They are not stable, they are in flux all the time. You always see new articles about species coming about. Now, species are not kinds. They are not those biblical kinds that we just read about in all those Bible verses.
Well, are you going to define kind? Because you said you would. And really, that's the important thing here, since it seems to be the basis for your disagreement with the scientific establishment.
So, we're going to talk about the differences between kinds and species. Now, baraminology is the creationist study of the created kinds. The Hebrew bara means created.
Wrong. It's the lexical form of the verb to create. And as in other Semitic languages, in Hebrew the lexical form is the 3rd person singular simple past form. It means he created. It's an active verb with a third-person subject.
And the Hebrew min means kind. So baramin means created kind.
No, since Hebrew is a verb-subject-object language, and the phrase barat min lacks any indication that min is anything but the subject, it means, quite literally, a kind created. Creationists can't even get Hebrew right, the language their favorite book is written in, and somehow they think they're going to show up basically all of science. Good luck, guys.
And that is also baramins. So for example, you have giraffes and okapis. They belong to the giraffid baramin, the giraffe kind. Okapis are actually related to giraffes. In case you guys don't know what these are an animal that was only discovered in 1901. They're from the Congo in Africa. And they have 18-inch long tongues, and they can actually produce sound that's too low for people to hear. People didn't even think these were real, but now they're quite popular in zoos. But even though they look like a zebra, they are actually related to giraffes. So this here is your giraffid baramin.
What about the North American pronghorn, which shares the ossicones of giraffes and okapi, as well as many other features and a genetic similarity to boot? Scientists put them in Giraffoidea, next to the deer and sheep as a sister group to them. Why isn't the baramin Giraffoidea?
Now notice that is two different species, so it is different than a specific species.
But earlier you said that an animal can't become another type of animal. But those aren't the same type. They're not even in the same genus. So I guess you were lying, or rather you haven't defined what a type is, nor have you really defined what a kind is. You're just giving alleged examples.
So when we're looking at animal classification, we've got this list again for the jaguar here. So what is the kind? The kind is usually at this family level right here. So in the jaguar's case, he belongs to the feline kind, and that includes everything from cougars to bobcats to tigers to snow leopards, as well as the jaguar. Sometimes kinds are at the genus level, sometimes they're at the order level, but in general, your biblical kind is going to be at this family level right here.
What about genets? They're so cat-like, I'm not sure people could reliably distinguish them from cats. Or what about the extinct nymphorids? They were externally indistinguishable from true cats as far as anyone can tell, and only details of their ear and skull anatomy distinguish them. Why aren't these in the cat kind? Do they each have their own kind? How do you know? It would help if you defined the kind, and you say that the kind can get as high as class, so why isn't mammal a kind? Is it because it makes you uncomfortable to be in the same kind as a warthog?
So, for the feline kind, God created this feline kind back in the Garden of Eden. They would have had all the genetic potential to create all the species we see today. So God did not create a pair of tigers, a pair of lions, and a pair of jaguars. He just created the original feline kind.
See, that's part of the problem, though. Your idea has a flood that wipes out all felines but a single breeding pair. So you could only have modern felines in such a scenario with the genetic diversity you could get from a single breeding pair. And since apparently you can only use the existing genetic diversity, as you stated earlier in this talk, that means we really can't expect there to be any mitochondrial or Y chromosome haplogroups in Felidae, nor can we expect more than 4 alleles total for any locus on the nuclear DNA of big cats, or 3 in the case of genes on the X chromosome. But, as it turns out, just the clouded leopard has nearly a score of mitochondrial haplogroups. So either you're wrong about species not being able to gain new diversity through mutation, or you're wrong about Felidae being a kind, and in fact Noah must have brought some 20 or so female clouded leopards on the ark, even though they're not clean, so he should have brought at most 2.
And again, God only sent 1 pair of felines to the ark. He did not need to send a pair of lions, a pair of tigers, and a pair of jaguars.
Actually, according to your reasoning, it looks like he probably had to send dozens of each, just to account for the mitochondrial diversity, and that's ignoring the even greater diversity in the nuclear DNA. Or, you could abandon what is basically your only objection to evolution, that it cannot increase genetic diversity.
He just sent that pair of felines, and they had all the genetic potential to create all the species we see today.
Nope, because that's impossible. There's too much diversity in every species of felid in the world, including cheetahs, who are already incredibly inbred, for that story to be feasible. Sure, you can miracle it and say God restored some of the diversity in each generation through God mutations, but at that point, why bother saving any cats at all? Just magic the whole kind back, or forget about the whole flood, and magic all the naughty people to death, and leave the innocent kitties alone. See, the story just doesn't work from any literal angle.
Now, felines may interbreed to create things like this. This is a tigon, which is the father is a tiger and the mother is a lion. They may interbreed to create these different hybrids or even new species, but they're still cats. They're not turning into anything different. They're not breeding with anything different.
But the different cats are different. That's why they're in different species and genera. So they are making things that are different according to you. And yeah, when two cats breed, they make a cat. That's not exactly something evolution would predict shouldn't happen.
A cat cannot breed with a dog. A cat cannot breed with a horse. But a cat can breed within their kind, the feline kind. But they're still cats. They're not turning into anything different.
Except that, as far as I've been able to tell, no felids have ever bred outside their genus. So you can have Panthera hybrids and Felis hybrids, but there have never been any Panthera Felis hybrids. So apparently, a kind can become so diverse that it can't breed with other members of the kind. I guess that means that cats being unable to breed with dogs doesn't mean they're not in the same kind. So maybe Carnivora is the right level for kind. How would you know? And of course, she wouldn't. But any attempts of her to actually define a kind will have to wait. Because that's it for today. If you like this video, please remember to hit the like button, and if you're not subscribed, hit the subscription button. If you don't have notifications turned on, why don't you hit the notification bell so you're always informed whenever there's new Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I guess it's time for more of Karina Altman listing off animals, and then thinking that noticing that they are in taxonomic families means that the story of Noah's Ark isn't completely impossible for basically infinite reasons. Get some popcorn, a drink, and let's get back into the stupid.
Alright, so we have so much diversity within the animal kinds today. So, for example, we've got our eagle kind. This is a stellar sea eagle, which is one of the largest and rarest raptors in the world. It has a 9-foot wingspan. You've got the harpy eagle. These guys eat monkeys and sloths. They can fly up to 50 miles per hour and can see something 1 inch wide from 220 yards away. And you've got this Philippine eagle. It can see 8 times better than you can. It has 7-foot long wingspan, and it's one of the rarest eagles in the world. But all of these guys belong to the eagle kind, and those are pretty amazing animals, but very different in appearance and location. So where did all these species come from?
Well, hold your eagles there. Eagles are not a taxonomic group. It's a colloquial term for the largest soaring members of the family Accipitridae, which also includes hawks and even other things called vultures and buzzards, but that aren't true vultures. In fact, various eagles are more closely related to other non-eagles than they are to each other. So not only have you failed yet again to define a kind, you certainly haven't even successfully identified one.
Now, evolutionists today teach that today's animal species have been like this for thousands of years. However, the Bible says that the original animal kinds existed just 4,300 years ago on Noah's Ark.
A time frame far too short to allow for all the mutations it would take to see modern animals. And if mutation rates were for some reason faster after the Ark, you would get too many per animal to be viable, and you'd just see everything go extinct. Mutation has to go at a fairly sedate pace in order for the number of mutations per generation to be something selection can act on in any other way than just resulting in extinction.
So, definitions of species can get a little bit confusing. So the word species originally meant biblical kinds.
Citation needed.
In Linnaeus' day, this was synonymous with kinds. However, later, species began referring to more specific animals.
The majority of species identified by Linnaeus are still valid species. So I don't think we can say that species ever referred to the entirety of Felidae as a single species, as you seem to be implying. If you think it did, please tell us where it was used this way and by whom, because I think you're trying to anachronistically project modern 20th century ideas about creationism back into the 18th century.
So initially, the word species meant something like the feline kind. Now, species means something like jaguar.
Again, citation needed. But even so, we're talking about modern science and our current understanding of biology. So even if a term that is now used in science in a particular way was used in the past in another way, it doesn't really change the current science any. Even the word evolution didn't always have its current specific scientific use at one point.
So there are many variations among animals using the new definition of species. So it used to be just the rhino species, but now we would refer to this as the rhino kind, and then there's 5 species of rhino here.
Wait, what about tapirs? who have nearly identical feet, and nearly identical teeth, and extremely similar skulls, excepting the nasal region? Or what about horses, who share many similarities in the skeleton, musculature, and especially in the feet and skull? Why can't we have a rhinoceroidea kind? Or a parasaudactyl kind? We could include the rhinos, tapirs, chalicotheres, and horses all on the ark with only a couple animals. And there's the bonus that when they get off, they can all mutate to the point where they look like failed Ripley clones from Alien Resurrection.
So, when theologians talked about species as unchanging biblical kinds, they were challenged. Critics often object to the Bible's accuracy because it says that species are fixed, but we see species changing today.
Well, that's a stupid criticism, because as far as I can tell, the Bible doesn't say anything about species, and it doesn't really say much about kinds, except that they were created. But that doesn't mean they couldn't change.
However, the original definition of species meant created kinds, which do not change, so the Bible is correct.
Except they do change. You said the cat kind changed into house cats, wild cats, bobcats, jaguars, lions, leopards, cheetahs, etc. Those aren't the same. The ancestor of a jaguar and a house cat wasn't a house cat or a jaguar. Neither of us think it was. So they changed. Sure, not into something that wasn't a cat, but that's how evolution works. Things remain inside their ancestral clades, and new clades erupt from within established ones.
In fact, today's scientific community disagrees on the term because new subspecies are forming and species are changing constantly. So it doesn't even really have a solid definition today, but it is currently the most specific taxon of the animal classification system.
Well, it has a few different definitions because different organisms require slightly different definitions. For example, a group of reproductively compatible organisms that can produce interfertile offspring can be considered a species, but that doesn't work too well for asexual or extinct species. Still though, you just said yourself that there are subspecies, and that in fact is more specific than species. For example, Canis lupus is divided into some 9 subspecies, including Canis lupus arctus, the Arctic wolf, Canis lupus familiaris, the domestic dog, Canis lupus dingo, the Australian dingo, and Canis lupus lupus, the Eurasian grey wolf.
However, even with all the change, animals do stay within their kinds, and no new kinds are evolving.
How do you know? You haven't defined a kind. You've given alleged examples, but not told us how you know where the barriers are.
Again, hogs are still hogs. For instance, we've got a bunch of fun pig species in the world today. This is a little warthog. They can live 10,000 feet high on Mount Kilimanjaro and survive months without water. You've got red river hogs, which love to swim, and they also play dead. And then you've got this babirusa here. A lot of people think this guy's pretty funky. They're from Indonesia. The word means pig deer. They're great swimmers. They can eat just about anything, and those tusks can be 17 inches long. But they're all still hogs, or pigs, right? They're not turning into anything else. They are staying within their hog kind.
Ah, family Suidae, the old world pigs. Great diverse bunch of successful generalists. But what's that running around in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and all through Mexico? It's a little animal that looks like a suid, but it's got the wrong number of toes, and its tusks go down rather than curling up. Oh, it's a javelina, or collared peccary. Peccaries are members of family Thyasuidae. I mean, they sure look like pigs, they act like pigs, they live like pigs. Why aren't they part of the same kind? Is it because someone decided to put the family-level taxa there and divide them up? Why does that taxonomist get to tell God what to do after the fact? I don't know, and since you won't define kind, you can't tell me.
All right, so what caused all this diversity within these animal kinds? We're going to talk about several of the causes.
That sounds like fun, and at least your list of alleged kinds let me bring up neat animals that are closely related to animals that people usually know about, but that aren't actually those animals. So thanks.
So, diversity. God gave his creation incredible genetic diversity. Even though we may have started with only that pair of felines, look at all the amazing cat species and breeds you see today.
Well, each breed of cat has more diversity than could be found front-loaded onto a single pair of cats on the ark. So your explanation of God simply giving them the genetic diversity doesn't really work if we're to assume he just gave it to that initial breeding pair some 4,000 years ago.
Now, animals have the ability to constantly adapt to new conditions, which is very important, especially after the flood, when the world was very different. All that genetic potential God gave them was so that they could adapt to new surroundings, because ecosystems change all the time. So, here's an example. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a saiga. It's a critically endangered antelope from Asia. Look at that giant schnoz.
Okay, I love saiga, and they're really very endangered, so thank you for telling people about them. I doubt they're going to be saved from extinction, but it's still an incredible animal, and I'm glad you've introduced them to people. I mean that sincerely.
It looks ridiculous, right? It looks like a Muppet. However, this is actually very important for this animal because they live high up in the mountains of Asia. That big old nose filters dust and cools down their blood in the summer, and then in the wintertime it heats up air so they don't freeze with that cold air.
So, is it your contention that all the genes needed to produce this big nose were in at least one of the original 2 antelopes on the ark? I sure hope you tell us.
So even though they look kind of ridiculous, this is actually optimal for the conditions that they live in, and God gave them this ability to adapt to their environments. So, pretty amazing animal. All right, so what caused some of this diversity? We see some crazy diversity in the world today, right? Here's an example. This is a legless lizard. They're from Europe.
Okay, nope, no more examples. I'm going to cut the rest of them. She goes on for well over a minute listing off cool animals, and yes, they're cool, but no number of cool animals that exist will by their existence explain her proposed mechanism for biodiversity.
Now, there are several main things that you'll usually hear in science class. There are many different causes. We're just going to talk about the main ones. So first of all, natural selection. Now, natural selection is not evolution, and we'll get to that next.
I guess technically it's not, but it's sort of like saying using the steering wheel isn't driving. Sure, that's true. In and of itself, a steering wheel isn't driving. And in and of itself, natural selection isn't evolution. But both are important parts of the process, and the main way the process is directed.
You'll also often hear mutations, but mutations are not actually really a significant cause, but you'll often hear that it is in science class.
A cause? Well, that's an odd way to put it. Mutations are the source of the genetic variation. And if they're not, then you're going to have a doozy of a time trying to explain why every one of those things you pretend is a kind has too much variation for that to have been all built into a single mating pair on Noah's Ark, or even 7 or 14 animals if they're clean.
Now next we've got selective breeding.
Well, that's not part of the evolution of wildlife, but it is for domesticated animals.
And so we'll talk about all of these in depth in a moment. So new species are always being formed, but there are no new kinds evolving. So again, remember the difference between those two words.
I can't remember the difference. You never told me what it is. You just gave examples that you allege without any particular reason are kinds.
All right, so we're going to talk about natural selection first. So the definition of natural selection is a non-directional process where organisms possessing certain characteristics survive better than others in a given environment or selective pressure.
Well, maybe by non-directional, you mean undirected, since natural selection definitely can and does put directional selection pressure on populations. That's why it changes them in definite directions. For example, if we're going to go with okapis and giraffes as being related by descent, which you've already agreed to, then there must have been some directional selection going on to get such different proportions. But if you meant undirected in that there is no person directing it, then that's fine. It's just pressure from the environment that does not require anyone sitting there and deciding what should be selected for. That's the difference between natural and artificial selection.
So basically, the animals with the most favorable characteristics to survive in their environment will breed, and those without them will die.
No, they'll all die, because that's life. But the ones who reproduce more will spread their genes more, leading to the genetic makeup of the population being different from generation to generation. Natural selection isn't always a binary breed or die. Say we have a mouse population that finds itself stuck on a sandy island. It has enough food, but the surroundings are much lighter in color, and so dark-colored mice are more easily spotted by hawks and owls. Well, that doesn't mean dark-colored mice aren't going to ever breed. But if the average dark mouse only has 2 litters in its life, but the average light-colored mouse has 5, then guess whose genes are going to dominate? Either way, they're both going to die, and both likely by getting eaten by a bird. But the differential reproductive success of the dark versus light mice will mean that there is a trend toward light-colored mice predominating in that local population. In fact, this scenario played out over a few thousand years in deer mice in Florida, who are now predominantly of the agouti color morph. In these mice, melanosomes simply fail to develop, leaving them white or straw-colored and able to blend in the sandy coastal regions they inhabit. Further, scientists know exactly what mutation causes this, so we have both the selection pressure and the mutation.
If the given environment or selective pressure were to change, the characteristics of those organisms will also change.
This is very true and very important. Mutations and traits are only beneficial situationally. Those deer mice would be at a big disadvantage in forests farther north, where the majority of deer mice live. So pointing out, as creationists often do, that a beneficial mutation would be harmful if the environment changed means nothing, because that's the point of beneficial mutations.
So even though animals belong within the same kind, they may look very different depending on where they live.
Maybe, but despite heavily implying that you were going to tell us what a kind is, you haven't.
For instance, let's look at frogs. This is a red-eyed tree frog. They're from Central and South America, and they basically depend on leaves for their entire lives. So they've got those suction toes to stick underneath the leaves. They're green to help camouflage. They actually lay their eggs under leaves so the tadpoles will fall directly into the water when they're ready.
Okay, hold up. Why is it that for mammals, a kind is a family, but then for frogs we're going to put the whole order in a kind? Frogs are at least as different from each other as any two, say, carnivorans are. If we're going to say that the tailed frog, the cane toad, the poison dart frog, and the bullfrog are in the same kind, then there's no reason to say that the mongoose, the tiger, the bear, and the seal aren't in the same kind. Or even a whale, a camel, a giraffe, and a goat. Oh wait, it's because you think that frogs are less visually distinct, so forget the actual diversity. You get to put all those frogs into a single kind and save space on the ark. I forgot, you don't actually care about biology.
However, on the opposite side of the world, you've got this little desert rain frog. It's only 2.5 inches long, but it lives in the deserts of Namibia. And you might not think a frog would do very well in the desert, but they actually have a transparent patch on their stomach that helps them absorb moisture in the sand. And they're actually nocturnal, so again, that helps them stay cooler. They actually sound like little dog squeaky toys. They're pretty cute.
Okay, you're giving examples of frogs. We get it. I'm going to stop you now so you can get to a point.
But again, they're all still frogs. They're not turning into anything different.
And you, a lemur, a capuchin monkey, a tarsier, and a chimpanzee are all still primates. In fact, some of the frogs you talked about are far more different from each other than you are from a chimp. I'm not really sure you thought this through. If order can be a kind, then guess what? Most of the evolution you say is unacceptable is actually perfectly plausible, except there's no way it could happen with the small number of animals on the ark. In fact, if all modern examples of a kind came from the animals on the ark, and an order can be a kind, I guess Noah and his sons and daughters-in-law were not just the ancestor of all humans, but also of all chimpanzees, bonobos, lorises, etc. That's a strange idea. I know you'd reject it, but if we're going to let kind be a whole order, why? It's not any less reasonable than all the frogs coming from a single mating pair of frogs on the ark. In fact, given that there's more genetic diversity in frogs than in any mammal order, it's more reasonable to say that all primates descend from Noah than it is to say all frogs descended from a pair on the ark.
So actually, one of the men who has the best definition of natural selection is Charles Darwin himself in his book, Origin of Species. There is a constant struggle for survival because of population growth and limited resources, and certainly each kind can produce many varieties. Therefore, there will be survival of the fittest, or natural selection of those varieties of a population that fit best into their environments. Given enough generations and the right trait combinations, organisms that seem designed for their environment will simply result from natural selection. This is the correct definition, but again, this is not evolution.
I mean, it's not track and field, and it results in changes in organisms from one generation to the next, due to changes in allele frequency, so I think it is evolution.
He tried to force it to be a driving force behind evolution, because he believed if given enough time, natural selection could create new animals. But this is incorrect, because natural selection is actually the opposite of evolution. You are losing genetic information. You are not gaining it.
Well, first, it is getting new animals. Because even if we stick to things you said are related, like all frogs, producing a cane toad, a hairy frog, and a poison dart frog requires new animals, because those things aren't the same animal, and they're not the same animal that would have gotten off of your ark. And no one claims that natural selection produces variation. That's mutations. Your need to argue against a straw man of evolution does not strengthen your case. If anything, it makes you seem like you can't actually argue against what evolution really is.
So, natural selection is simply a mechanism God uses to allow organisms to adapt to their environments.
I mean, sure, I'll just grant you God's bare existence, and so all things that happen must be allowed to happen by God, assuming he's omnipotent. But that's not really a meaningful statement. If God exists and is omnipotent, then X happened and God allowed X to happen are identical statements in terms of the meaning behind them. because all the things that God doesn't allow simply don't happen.
Evolution requires the creation of new genetic material. However, natural selection decreases or eliminates genetic material.
Hey, you're right. Good thing there's a well-known mechanism for increasing genetic material, because without it, even your arc idea with kinds diversifying after dispersal from the arc wouldn't work. I mean, it still doesn't work with that mechanism, but it would work even less well without it.
So here's two more examples. Your environment is going to determine which of the genetics in that animal are going to be selected for. For instance, you've got these two types of goat. So this one up here, this is a mountain goat. They're from the Rockies here in America. They can live up to 13,000 feet high, and they live among snow and ice on the cliffs. And it gets pretty cold, so this thick, fluffy winter coat does really well up there to help it camouflage and stay warm. However, next to it, this is a Nubian ibex. They're from the deserts of northern Africa, where it's very hot and arid, and it's very brown. So they've got that short brown coat to help them blend into the desert and stay cool, and that coat actually helps reflect heat and radiation. Now, this goat would not do well up in the Rockies, and this goat would not do well in the deserts of Africa, right? But they're both part of the same animal kind. They're not changing into anything else. They're just being genetically selected for the best way to survive their environment.
Okay, there's nothing in that that really contradicts evolution, especially since you won't define kind. I'm honestly not sure what the point of that was. Neat animals, though.
So one of the biggest evidences that they try to tell you for natural selection would be Darwin's finches. Now, these are actually not finches. They are tanagers. It's a totally different kind of bird.
So with birds, we're back to family-level kinds, huh? I wonder why. But also, what about doves? They're in the same superfamily as tanagers, that is, Passeroidea. Why can't they be in the same kind? We can't say, because you didn't tell us.
So what he likes to say is these guys evolved different beak types depending on what food was most prevalent on the island of the Galapagos that they were native to.
And to prove that that's false, all you have to do is prove that they don't have a common ancestor. But you think they do, so that's out. The other option is to show that the beak structure is not determined by different genomes. Let's see if you make that argument, because otherwise they did evolve, because that's what evolution is.
So this guy does really well eating seeds, whereas the other guy does really well with buds and fruit. This guy eats leaves, and this guy eats insects. So each of their beaks changed, they like to say evolved, to help them eat best on whatever island. However, again, this is not evolution.
You can't just state that and let it go. Why isn't that evolution? It meets the definition of change in a population's allele frequency over time. New tanagers evolved from the ancestral tanagers through changes to their genomes.
They're still finches. They're not turning into anything else.
Well, I thought they were tanagers, and I took your word for it, but I guess now they're finches. I don't really care either way, but if they turned into non-finches, it would be against the laws of evolution. In evolution, there is common descent, so the original finch, since that's what we're going with now, gave rise to new finches, and let's just call one of those finches the Galapagos finch. That finch would give rise to new Galapagos finches, but they wouldn't stop being finches, or birds, or amniotes, or tetrapods, etc. And they can't even stop being Galapagos finches, because that's a clade. That is, all the descendants of a common ancestor plus that ancestor. Once a population starts a clade, all future descendants will be in that clade. Even if in 100 million years some Galapagos finches become a featherless, scaly, T-Rex-sized super predator that can't fly, it'll still be a Galapagos finch.
Their beaks are just best adapted to the food sources on their Galapagos island. So these guys are going to do really well on an island full of seeds, but birds that look like this are going to die out, right? You're losing that genetic information.
Okay, but there's already too much genetic information, and I use the term loosely, for it to have all been present in a single pair of breeding birds. We know it had to arise, so losing genetic information from natural selection doesn't preclude universal common descent, because adding information to the genome is trivial and observed routinely in nature.
So, in conclusion, natural selection can decrease genetic information and adapt animals to their habitats, as well as eliminate the weak and sick organisms. It cannot create new genetic information or allow organisms to evolve from molecules to man.
Well, that's true, although I don't know why you threw the last one in there. Obviously, natural selection can't work until it has something to select, and that can't happen until you have a genetic system, which is quite a few steps into the sequence of having abiotic simple chemicals form into highly derived apes like humans. But no one thinks that natural selection drove abiogenesis.
So next we'll talk about mutations. So this is a white-tailed deer here with piebaldism, which makes it kind of patchy, so it's white and normal colored. Now, it's really beautiful, but this mutation is not ideal in the wild because that fawn is going to stand out to predators like a sore thumb, right? So mutations are typically not good things.
In its current environment, yes. But what if it entered a new environment where stands of brownish vegetation were interrupted by stretches of light-colored terrain? Then it might well be better than the standard counter-shaded deer coloration. And the thing is, you already know this, because earlier you said that beneficial traits are beneficial in an organism's environment, and that if the environment changes, then which traits are beneficial will change. So piebald coloring may well be advantageous in certain environments.
So what is a mutation? It is a permanent change to the DNA of an organism. Again, it is not a gain of information. You are not evolving. You are losing or changing the information that was already there.
No.
From the level of a species' genome, every mutation increases information, because every mutation must be recorded separately if you want to keep a whole species' genome record. You can't simply say by fiat that mutations decrease information. Just look at your piebald deer example. Was information lost? It now has a new pattern it didn't have before. And also we can see the original spotted pattern of juvenile deer is still there. That seems like more information, just on the face of it.
There is no mutation that results in the gain of new genetic traits required for molecules to man evolution.
Again, because the first steps of that process wouldn't be evolutionary or involve a genome, so I don't know what your point is.
So here's another example of mutation. This is albinism. So all mutations, even beneficial ones, are a loss or variation of pre-existing genetic traits.
Well, yeah, but that variation can increase the information and even preserve the old information. For example, we know that more than one line of fish has evolved proteins that act as antifreeze, allowing them to survive in the extreme cold of the polar oceans. And the way this happens is that a gene is duplicated, resulting in two functioning copies of a gene that produces some protein. Then one copy mutates to form a new protein that inhibits the formation of ice crystals. And bam! New protein. Old protein is still there, new genetic information.
So this is actually a tawny frogmouth here. These are birds from Australia, and they are ambush predators. So they rely on holding still and waiting for their prey to come to them. Now, a normal tawny frogmouth blends in perfectly to a tree. I don't know if you've ever seen these guys in zoos, but sometimes they're very difficult to see because their camouflage is so great, and they depend on that for survival. So this guy, even though he's got this mutation that makes him look really pretty, he's not going to do well out in the wild, right? Because he's going to stand out, and all of his prey is going to run away from him. He's not going to be able to catch any food.
Well, it is gaining information, and yeah, it's probably not beneficial in any context a tawny frogmouth is likely to encounter. But so what?
So even though this is a cool mutation and it didn't kill him, he's not going to do well at all in the wild. It is not evolution at all. It's not gaining new information. It's not even beneficial.
I'll agree, most mutations are not beneficial to most organisms in the environments in which they find themselves.
So most mutations do have those neutral or negative effects, like this albinism.
Well done! You found a scientist pointing out that an area of evolutionary biology needs more research. I wonder if during the subsequent years we can find any other biologists finding mechanism for the formation of novel traits. Well, here's the abstract of one such paper titled Multiple Recent Co-options of Optics Associated with Novel Traits in Adaptive Butterfly Wing Radiations by Arnold Martin, Kyle J. McCullough, Nipam H. Patel, Adriana D. Briscoe, Lawrence E. Gilbert, and Robert D. Reed, published February 5, 2014, in the spring volume of the journal Nature. Quote, while the ecological factors that drive phenotypic radiations are often well understood, less is known about the generative mechanisms that cause the emergence and subsequent diversification of novel features. Heliconius butterflies display an extraordinary diversity of wing patterns due in part to mimicry and sexual selection. Identifying the genetic drivers of this crucible of evolution is now within reach, as it was recently shown that cis-regulatory variation in the optics transcription factor explains red pattern differences in the adaptive radiations of the Heliconius melpomene and Heliconius eratos species groups. Unquote. Here's another one. This time, neo-functionalization of embryonic head patterning genes facilitates the positioning of novel traits on the dorsal head of adult beetles, by Eduardo E. Zatara, Hana A. Busey, David M. Linz, Yoshinori Tomoyasu, and Armin P. Moczek. Published July 13, 2016, in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. I'm not going to quote the whole abstract as it's long, But they found that mutations in a particular group of Hox genes can cause new traits to evolve in the head ornamentation of beetles. So while evolution of novel traits isn't the best understood thing in the world, it's not like it's a complete mystery or impossible.
All right, so here is a excerpt from a paper called A Golden Age for Evolutionary Genetics in the Trends in Genetics magazine. It says, most studies of recent evolution involve the loss of traits, and we still understand little of the genetic changes needed in the origin of novel, which means new, traits. Over the broad sweep of evolutionary time, what we would really like to explain is the gain of complexity in the origins of novel adaptations.
Ooh, that's embarrassing. I pre-debunked this with 2 citations even newer than yours. Sorry about that.
So even evolutionists admit that none of these methods are really answering their questions on how animals could evolve because they all involve the loss of traits or the loss of genetic information.
How about, say, the Milano mutation, which shields humans from heart disease by causing changes to the structure of apolipoprotein, which results in humans with the mutation being basically immune to increases in chances of cardiovascular disease from high HDL cholesterol levels. That sure seems beneficial given that heart disease is the #1 cause of death in most industrial countries. There you go. I found a beneficial mutation.
Now, sometimes you'll hear about so-called beneficial mutations. Now, some mutations can certainly be unique, but they're not truly beneficial. So this is a fruit fly. They often use fruit flies in genetic experiments because they breed very quickly. It's got 4 wings. That's really cool, but it's not actually very helpful to that fly. He can't fly at all. So it's cool, it's unique, but it's not actually helping him.
Oh, so there are beneficial mutations. And like you already agreed earlier in this speech, traits are only beneficial in a given environment, so you've refuted yourself. Congratulations! It's like I don't even need to be here sometimes.
Now, there are some mutations that have beneficial outcomes, but only in very specific environments. An example of this is antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You might hear about these guys all the time as living evolution, living proof of evolution. But it's actually not. Again, these mutations actually damage their normal functions.
No, because their normal functions are killing them in their environment. So these mutations greatly enhance their normal functions in their current environment.
They can't break down nutrients properly. If you were to take these bacteria out of a hospital setting, they would die.
And if you plopped a bunch of polar bears in the Congo, they would die. What's your point? It can't be that white fur isn't an advantage for polar bears, because it clearly is. Hospitals are an environment that exists, and bacteria in them are evolving to adapt to that environment. That's what evolution is. Organisms adapting to the environment in which they find themselves, or failing that and going extinct.
If the antibiotics were removed or they were taken to a normal environment, they die because they can't process food correctly. And again, they have not evolved new structures or organisms. They're still bacteria.
Still bacteria? So now a kind can be a whole domain? So I guess Noah didn't need to bring anything but himself and his family, because if a kind can be a whole domain, then Noah can be the ancestor of not only all the primates, but all the animals, plants, fungi, amoeba, algae, etc. Well, that does solve the problem of not having enough space on the ark. And then creationists will complain about their opponents telling them that, quote, kind is too nebulous a term and doesn't mean anything. Well, when Canidae and Neura and Prokaryota can be a kind despite being vastly different in terms of included diversity, you can see why people might object to this term.
Yeah, the bacteria are still bacteria. Even though they've got these mutations, they're not turning into anything else. And even these beneficial mutations are often only beneficial in a very, very specific environment.
Again, that's the point. Evolution isn't going to give anything superpowers. Evolution is a game of give and take. Organisms only have so much time, energy, and resources available to them, and so they have to balance out their needs with environmental pressures. The fact of the matter is that this means that adapting to a particular environment means being maladapted to other environments.
All right, so our next topic is selective breeding. So, what is selective breeding? It's crossing animals together to acquire desired traits. Now, a lot of people like to say that this is modern-day evolution. The creation of new breeds is proving evolution.
Well, it's not proving evolution, it's just a small-scale but very noticeable example of evolution in an unusual but easy-to-observe environment.
However, you are not creating new kinds.
Maybe, but you haven't said what a kind is, and apparently it can be so big that a horse, like you pictured, can be in the same kind as a patch of moss.
You're just revealing the genetic features already in the original design of the animals involved.
No.
Here's an example where we know you're wrong. You may have heard of Sphinx cats, a breed of hairless cats. The thing is that these cats all descend from two hairless cats, one born in 1975 and the other in 1978, both of whom had novel mutations resulting in a loss of function in genes regulating keratinization of hair follicles. So that's a new mutation that was selected for, not part of the already existing genetics. More recently, in 1987, a different cat breed, the Donskoy cat, was established from a hairless cat resulting from a different mutation. So if you're going to pretend that breeders can only select from genetics already established in a population and can't use mutations, you're just wrong. They can and do take advantage of novel mutations.
So even though you've got this little tiny miniature horse here and this giant Clydesdale, they're still horses, right? They haven't turned into anything else. They are still horses.
Yes, they are, demonstrating that the evolutionary law of monophily is still in operation and evolution is working as predicted.
All right, so are breeds the same thing as species?
Generally, no, they are not.
They are not. So a breed is a stock of animals within a species having distinctive appearance developed by selective breeding. So for instance, you've got your chickens. This is an Iamsimani, this is a silky chicken, and this is a Polish chicken. They all look very, very different, but they're all chickens, right?
Right, because evolution says they have to be.
There's no new information being gained. You're simply taking the genetic potential that was already there and isolating it to create these different breeds.
Well, we already know that's not true when it comes to cats. I see no reason to think it's true with chickens. In fact, there are 4 breeds of chicken with blue meat that result from mutation. Amusingly, the first chicken you showed, the Iamsimani, is one of those chickens.
So they are not species. They don't have scientific names. They're not a part of the classification system. So even though these are 3 different breeds of chickens, they all have the same scientific name, which is Gallus gallus, the domestic chicken.
In fact, Gallus gallus refers to the red jungle fowl. Gallus gallus domesticus refers to the domesticated subspecies. And you will not be able to take the wild red jungle fowl and breed them into the Iamsimani chicken that you showed with its blue meat without them mutating.
So let's look at a really common example, which is dogs. So there are 36 species of dogs, canines, in the world. You have things like the bat-eared fox, which has those giant ears to help with thermoregulation, which is regulating its body heat. You've got the bush dog, which is sometimes called the vinegar dog because they smell like vinegar. They also have webbed feet. They're good swimmers.
Okay, I'm not going to go through all however many species of canines. So from here, we'll cut until you get to your point.
So 36 species of dogs in the world. However, all domestic dog breeds belong to one single subspecies of the gray wolf, which is Canis lupus familiaris.
Well, that depends on exactly what you want to do with dingoes. They're closer to Canis lupus familiaris than any other Canis lupus subspecies, but they are sometimes considered their own subspecies, namely Canis lupus dingo, and they are almost certainly descended from domesticated dogs brought by humans.
So, even though you have this amazing variety of breeds, they all belong to one single subspecies of the wolf. There's actually about 400 domestic dog breeds today. The majority of today's 400 breeds were created in the last 500 years, and most of those were created in the last 150 years.
So high amounts of selection pressure can cause drastic morphological changes in a short time. Seems like a plus for the plausibility of evolution.
So the majority of those 400 breeds, which are all very different, were created in the last 150 years. That's an incredible amount of diversity that's happened very quickly.
That's true.
And each of these breeds has its own unique set of physical and behavioral traits that were selectively bred for a purpose. Now, this extreme variation in such a short time defies evolutionary claims that drastic changes have to take place slowly over a long period of time.
Not really, because those changes result in significant health problems that, in any but a domesticated setting with access to veterinary care, would be non-viable. This is because humans tend to select too harshly in order to get the desired traits as quickly as possible. Nature tends to have far too many selection criteria for this kind of rapid morphological change to be viable. Evolution isn't going to turn a fox into a Great Dane-sized animal in a couple centuries, because the fox couldn't adapt its diet, social structure, behavior, and limb girdles fast enough to be good at surviving in the wild. But humans could do it. Because if their goal was a Great Dane-sized fox, they can fix those problems by just giving the animals in question an artificially ideal environment.
But look at just the variety within this one picture. That's an amazing amount of variety that's happened very, very quickly. And God designed all that physical and behavioral variation within the canine's genetic makeup to begin with at creation.
Yeah, but the problem is that it doesn't matter what was there at creation, just what got on the ark. And we've already gone over other domesticated animals and shown how their creation was certainly not a result of selecting existing genetic variants, but required new variants. But heck, why not do the same for the doggos? One interesting mutation in dogs is black fur. Now, I know what you're thinking, that you've seen wolves with black fur. But we have DNA from before the domestication of dogs, and guess what? Only wolves with dog DNA from after the domestication of dogs have the black fur allele. Wolves never had black fur until a dog got the mutation for it. And hey, dogs like pugs with squished faces have a mutated version of the SMOC2 gene that causes it to largely cease functioning. And that's not a version of the gene you'll find in wolf populations, so it requires a mutation. Funny how pug is the first breed I decided to check on, and what do you know, you can't make pugs from wolves without mutations.
And again, even though they're very different, they're all still dogs, right? You can't breed a dog to a cat, you can't breed a dog to a horse, and they're not turning into anything else. They just are different dogs.
And dogs, cats, and horses are all furungulates. And you can't breed a furungulate with a non-furungulate, because that's how evolution works.
And it is a loss of information again. Once you get to a Chihuahua, you can't go back to a wolf, right? Because you've lost that information. You are not gaining anything new, so it is not evolution.
Well, no, in fact it required new information, and given enough time and new mutations, there's no reason why a Chihuahua couldn't converge back to a wolf-like body, but it would do so through new mutations. And so the genes responsible for those proportions would not be the same as they would in wolves. And that difference would show up in a genome sequence.
Based off of this, there was actually a paper in Discover magazine where they say, these are evolutionists that say, researchers who once assumed evolution required millennia are documenting species adapting in mere decades or even shorter time frames. Adaptation is happening right under our noses in our lifetimes. Species are evolving at speeds that Darwin could not have imagined. So, even evolutionists admit that changes within animals can actually happen very quickly. It doesn't require millions of years.
Right, but it still requires the speciation rate to be orders of magnitude higher than what's observed in nature for your flood idea to carry any water. It's true that a species can adapt to a new environment and split into some subspecies in a century or so, but we still don't see speciation rates that you need from the ark. Not even close. And the mutation rate needed to get such genetic variation as we see today in those animal families is much higher than is observed. Now, you could say that speciation and mutation rates were way higher in the past, but it's seeming a little contrived that it went down to a level that is in accord with what we'd expect based on common ancestry and the fossil record, just as soon as we could check. So suspicious that that explanation kind of sounds like a post hoc rationalization, the sort of thing you might call a rescue device.
And again, remember those dogs. You got hundreds of species in only about 150 to 500 years. So speciation within animals can also happen just as fast.
Wait, so dog breeds are a species now? I thought we both agreed that they weren't new species, but suddenly, when you need to justify ludicrously fast speciation, they can just be species? Seems a bit arbitrary and convenient that you just get to move the goalpost whenever it's convenient.
So domestication actually also verifies the creationist worldview. Evolutionists originally said domestication should require tens of thousands of years, but now they actually did a real-life experiment. Russian researchers successfully domesticated a silver variant of red foxes in just 50 years. So this is what they look like. And they started in 1959. They bred 130 of the friendliest foxes they could find together. They did not breed together aggressive ones. They just kept breeding the friendliest ones from each litter together. Within a few generations, they had foxes with floppy ears and wagging tails, as you can see here. And within a dozen generations, you had multicolored foxes that loved human attention and were friendly to strangers that were born. You can actually get these as pets. I would not recommend it from a zookeeper standpoint. Foxes smell really bad. They're very destructive. But you can get them if you would like. Again, would not recommend that. But the point is that domestication is possible in a very quick time period. It does not require thousands of years like the evolutionists used to claim.
Okay, domestication can be fast. I don't see how that's an argument against common descent, and I don't really care to engage with it if you're not even going to say how that's a problem for evolution. But I do want to say that her characterization of the experiment is broadly correct. Also, it made the fox fur much less beautiful, which defeated the point of the experiment, which was to create domesticated foxes for the fur trade. But they are adorable.
All right, so how do we identify which animals belong to which kind? So.
Wait, what is this? After all these years and after all these episodes, is she going to find an objective way to define kind that will let us know when something has become a new kind if such a thing occurred? I don't think she will, but I'm hyped.
The inability to hybridize does not mean two animals do not belong to the same created kind. For instance, alpacas and camels are a part of the same created kind, but the size difference prevents them from breeding, right? Alpacas are really little, camels are really big.
Nope, not gonna let you give your hybrid examples, because I already know that you think being able to breed means it's the same kind, but that not being able to breed doesn't mean it's a different kind. So let's skip by this. Because the important part is being able to tell what's not in a kind, not what is. Also, I cut out 6 minutes of uselessly listing off hybrid animals like growler bears and mules. You're welcome.
But they're still part of the same kind.
How do you know?
Now, scientists will also group animals together based on their physical characteristics and their DNA. There's something called cognitum, which basically means if you look at it, you kind of know they're related. For instance, if you saw 2 squirrels, 2 rabbits, and 2 rats next to each other, you would know which ones kind of belong with which, right?
Yes, the rats and the squirrels belong together, and the rabbits are the odd ones out. But if you tossed in a baboon, then the baboon would be the odd one out. And if you then added a shrew, the shrew would be the odd one out. So where is the kind? And don't tell me intuition, because that's subjective, and human intuition is really bad at figuring things out in science.
You can intuitively tell that, but they'll also use their DNA sequencing to figure out which animals belong to what kind.
Great. Intuition. Well, that's nonsense. Funny thing is, though, that when you use DNA, you recover the most likely explanation as universal common descent. So the only kind there is in the world is life kind, and humans share a common ancestor with bacteria.
All right. So now we're going to talk about how did all these animals fit on Noah's Ark.
So you're going to go with a kind is whatever I think it is. Just shut up about it. Really? I'm not surprised that that's your definition, if it can be called that, but I'm a little surprised you even bothered to say you were going to define a kind when you weren't ever planning to do so.
Genesis 6:19 through 20 says only representatives of air-breathing, land, animal, and bird kinds were present on the ark, not all species.
Then why do we have all the other animals that wouldn't have survived a flood? You know, basically all of them. They should all be extinct.
So remember, today there's about 2 million species in the world today, but most of those are invertebrates, which are animals without backbones, or marine life, which would not have to be on the ark, right?
This just in, invertebrates can survive any and all floods and don't have to worry about water salinity changes, what they're going to eat for a year, delicate ecosystems that would be destroyed, like coral reefs, etc. Same for fish, too. Oh wait, that's stupid, and you're an idiot.
So that eliminates most of your species right there. Now, what about insects? Do those count?
Well, they're air-breathing animals, so they should count.
This is a jeweled flower mantis from India. I think it's one of the most beautiful insects out there. So insects likely don't qualify because they do not breathe air through nostrils, and they could easily survive a worldwide flood as eggs, larvae, or pupae.
Yeah, spiracles make you immune to drowning. And you know, insect eggs and pupae aren't exactly waterproof. Nor do insects typically spend a year or so in any of those life stages. But even for the ones that do, like cicadas, who can spend more than a decade as a grub depending on species, those ones tend to burrow underground and feed on roots. What are they going to do underwater for a year with all the adult plants drowned because, spoilers, plants can drown? Of course, it's not easy to see what you do with a pair of cicada grubs on the ark either, so I guess it's just a bad time for the cicadas. In fact, I think the cicada just about debunks the story altogether. I knew they had to be good for something besides annoying the crap out of me.
But if they did board the ark, they wouldn't take up much room, right? They'd take up like this much space.
I mean, that depends on how many kinds there are, doesn't it? And since you've given us no way to know how many insect kinds there are, there's no way to even calculate how much space they might take up.
So there are some excellent articles on answersingenesis.org that address this very specific question. So if you want more information on this topic, I encourage you to look that up on answersingenesis.org.
Maybe. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in me looking that all up. Because if you are, I may look into it. If not, I'm not going to do it.
So once we eliminate all once we eliminate all marine and invertebrate species and get into the kinds mindset, that means the ark only needed to house the ancestors of today's less than 34,000 land-dependent vertebrate species. Again, a vertebrate is an animal with a backbone.
Too bad that makes the scenario less plausible rather than more plausible. But hey, it's not like the land-based vertebrates would have fared all that much better than all the extinct animals, since as you well know, being the zookeeper at the ark, even with modern climate control and powered ventilation, is fundamentally unsuited to housing animals for any length of time, never mind being filled to the brim with them.
So that amounts to only about 1,400 animal kinds.
It's always nice when you just make up a number and then don't bother to tell anyone how you came up with it, or give them a way to check your numbers. You know, in science, you have to give your methods, and if people can't use your methods to get similar results, it means you're basically a fraud. You didn't even attempt to get to that point, so you're basically frauds right from the word go.
And this was a number that was determined by a research group within Answers in Genesis here, using a biblical model for kinds.
Oh, a biblical model you didn't bother to share or publish. Again, that's what is considered fraud in the scientific community.
So, how could they have fit? This again adds up to about 6,800 individual animals. Now, 85% of those animals would have been 22 pounds or less.
I don't know how you know that. Apparently, a kind can vary from the size of a rusty spotted cat at 14 inches long and weighing less than a pound, to a tiger 11 feet long and weighing in at 700 pounds or so. So, how big was the ancestral felid? I don't know, and neither do you. At least not just on the basis of identifying these kinds.
That's not a lot of room at all, right?
As a zookeeper, you should know better. Even if you're correct, most mammals at least need considerable space for exercise, enrichment, etc., and will fare horribly if kept in some stall barely big enough to physically fit them. Just as a mild example, have you ever heard of stable vices? They're habits, some of which can become pathological, that develop in horses that spend too much time in their stables. Some of these vices can cause serious diseases such as colic in horses. Now imagine a whole slew of animals with such problems. Some animals in confined spaces will rub against the walls so much that they rub their skin off in patches. And you have to remember, this flood is supposed to have lasted a bit over a year.
And they would likely have been juvenile animals because they were responsible for repopulating their entire species. They also eat less, they produce less waste, they take up less space. So instead of taking a giant 15, 20-foot saltwater crocodile, you just needed to take the ancestor of the crocodilian kind as a little baby, right?
Oh, the problem there is that many animals can't survive without direct care from parents and demand much more frequent feedings and much more attention than adults. Plus, many animals raised away from the adults of their species develop serious behavioral problems. So that's not really an option either.
Because they are responsible for repopulating their entire species, so you don't want to take large, older animals, right? You want to take young animals who have a long reproductive life ahead of them.
What about animals who could die of old age on the ark, even if you took them on board as babies? Mice have trouble making it past their first birthday, and according to most interpretations, Noah was on the ark with all the animals for a year, give or take 10 days. There is even a rat species that has trouble making it past 6 months, and a chameleon species that typically can't get to a year old. Was a short lifespan just something that evolved within your undefined kinds? I don't know, but we certainly have reason to believe that there are animals that couldn't be taken on board as babies to be released after the flood, because they'd be dead by then.
And again, we're talking about the kinds representative, not each species. So you didn't need to take a pair of alligators, crocodiles, and caimans. You just needed to take this pair of the original crocodilian kind as a baby.
I wonder if she knows that according to the standard scientific model, alligators and crocodiles have a divergence time of 80 million years. A similar divergence time of 84 million years separates humans from giraffes. So, at a first level of approximation, an alligator is about as related to a crocodile as a human is to a giraffe. These kinds seem to be really nebulous, don't they?
So again, that adds up to 6,800 individual animals, 85% of which weighed less than 22 pounds, and they were babies. All right, so how big was the ark actually? So let's look at the Bible. In Genesis 6:14 through 16, it says the ark had 3 decks, and it was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. Well, what is a cubit? It is the distance from a person's elbow to the tip of their longest finger. Now, that is different for every person, so what we used was the royal cubit, which was used in a lot of ancient construction projects, and that amounted to between 20.4 to 21.6 inches. So when Answers in Genesis wanted to build the ark, they used the worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario, the smallest possible ark, would be using a cubit that is 20.4 inches long.
Maybe using the royal cubit, but your worst case scenario would assume the smallest cubit of an adult human, which would be considerably shorter. That being said, I don't really think the size of the ark facade of the building you built is out of line with what the story is trying to convey.
And that still gives you this. So this is the Ark Encounter. This is built to biblical scale. You guys can visit this in Williamstown, Kentucky, about 45 minutes away. I highly encourage it. So the biblical ark, worst case scenario, was still 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet tall, and had a 1.88 million cubic feet.
Okay, let's assume, to be generous, that all the decks on the ark are the same size. This means that we have 11,854 square meters, or a bit under 3 acres, to work with across all 3 decks. Let's compare this to the San Diego Zoo, which houses 3,700 animals, far fewer than the 6,800 that AIG claims on the basis of no evidence at all, is what was needed on the ark. The San Diego Zoo is 100 acres. This means that on average, each animal at the zoo has a bit more than 109 square meters. Each animal in the ark has just over 1 3/4 square meters. It's not easy to run the zoo for a year. In fact, it costs $230 million a year to run a zoo, with only about half as many animals as the ark, and they need almost 12 times more area per animal than the ark. And still, people complain about the poor quality of life of animals even in modern zoos, like the San Diego Zoo. And the thing is, our speaker here knows this. She's a zookeeper. She knows she couldn't keep animals in the ark with a staff of 8 for a year, especially if they were all babies, who need more, not less attention than adults.
That is a huge ship. Now, to put that into more perspective, here's the ark against some comparisons. So it's about 1.5 football fields long, 2 school buses wide, and 3 giraffes high. And it has the volume of 483 semi-trailers.
I like how she goes on about volume, when except for the very smallest of animals, you can't just stack animals on top of each other. The place where you have the crocodiles, you're not going to be able to put some deer on top of that. That's going to be it in terms of animal storage for that area on that deck. For the most part, all that having tall decks will do is make it so the tall animals can physically fit.
That is more than enough room for 6,800 baby animals, 85% of which weighed less than 22 pounds. So, plenty of room is still left for storage, as well as living space for Noah's family. So, this is what the ark looked like. It was not this tiny little fairy tale ship with animals crammed in it. This is a very different concept. So, again, when we go back to the Bible and read what the Bible says, it all makes much more sense.
But that's the thing, it doesn't. Your giant ark still has no ventilation, not enough room, far too many animals for the available staff, and it is supposed to have existed this way for a year. And that's forgetting about the fact that some of the animals need highly special diets. Take koalas. They only eat eucalyptus leaves, and only from branches, and only fresh. Even if you had a eucalyptus tree and took the leaves off of it to feed them, they wouldn't eat them, because koalas are so monumentally stupid that they won't recognize the leaves as food unless they're on a tree. So what? Did Noah need a eucalyptus tree in the koala enclosure? And you can't take baby koalas, because in order to get the bacteria into their guts to digest the tough eucalyptus leaves, they have to eat their mother's fecal matter for months. So the ark apparently had a garden with full-grown koalas eating from a eucalyptus tree on a boat where everything is dying of carbon dioxide and methane poisoning, while 8 people try to clean up the droppings of 6,800 animals.
So, in conclusion, God created all the animal kinds 6,000 years ago.
Even if he did, that doesn't matter, because any pre-flood diversity was wiped out.
Each kind started with animals that had vast genetic potential.
Nearly all of which would have been wiped out during the flood if we take the story seriously.
Noah had less than 6,800 juvenile animals on the ark, representing 1,400 kinds.
Except that he couldn't, because in most cases, infant animals are harder, not easier to take care of, and that number is based on literally nothing. You just made it up to make the story seem less absurd, but it's still completely absurd, so it didn't help.
As each of their descendant generations became isolated after the flood, they formed many new species,
which would require new genetic diversity to come about spontaneously, which is the whole thing you say can't happen, and it would need to come about at such a rate that the animals in question would simply die from an overload of mutations.
Natural selection, mutations, and selective breeding are all reasons for the diversity we see today. So the features of different individual populations of animals became more distinct and specialized as they adapted to their environments in a post-flood world, which were very different depending on where you are. For instance, here's the bear kind. So today we have 8 species of bears.
Yup, even the relatively small group of Ursidae is far too diverse to have come off of the Ark. Maybe if the only bears were brown and black bears, this might be feasible. But not really, because still, those 2 species internally have far too much genetic diversity to have arisen from just 2 bears getting off the Ark.
Very, very different bears spread all over the globe, but they're all still bears, right? They cannot breed with horses, they cannot breed with dogs, they cannot breed with cats. They are not turning into anything different. They are still bears.
Except that, according to you, not being able to breed doesn't mean that animals are in different kinds. So you haven't pointed out why horses, bears, and dogs can't be in the same kind. And since they're all furungulates, I'd say maybe they should be in the same kind. As for becoming something different, even if your idea were true, they did become different things. Can you tell the difference between a black bear, a polar bear, and a panda? Yes? Well then, their common ancestor became different things, didn't it? That's what evolution is. It's not birds turning into bears. It's bears diversifying into new kinds of bear. And over time, and assuming no widespread bear extinction, bears could evolve to look quite different from each other and from their common ancestor.
So again, this is important to be able to answer these questions.
I agree. It is important for creationists to answer these questions. Too bad this speech did nothing to help them do that. And that's it. She then just reads some Bible passages to say how important all of this is, and then gives an extended commercial for AIG material. Since I don't care about either, I'm not going to subject you to it. If you want that AIG material, I have full confidence that you can find it on your own. I have smart viewers. If you liked this video, please remember to hit like, and if you didn't, hit dislike and tell me why you didn't like it in the comments. If you're not subscribed, please do so, and if you haven't already, hit the bell icon so you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I'd like to thank my patrons, especially my $20 and above patrons, Van Tovend, Ian Chen, Speed of Sound, Chris Love, Henry Hutanen, and Bob Knob. My patrons help me keep this channel going because, as you may know, YouTube is a very volatile platform. If you'd like to help out, my patron tiers start at only $1 a month, and it automatically gets you access to the exclusive patron-only Discord server, as well as early access to my videos and voting for what next topic should be. For example, my patrons tend to be the ones who decide which episodes of Things That Aren't Dinosaurs I'm going to do, as well as sometimes who I'm going to cover next in the next debunking series. If you feel like a monthly donation isn't right for you, but you'd still like to support the channel, remember, every like and share and comment helps the channel. But if you'd like to help in a more material way, I do have a wishlist for Amazon.com and a Teespring store. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't